Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College. Like that, they were hanging out in the studio lot, and they said, we need some cowboys in the background. Chesterton swears there's some footage somewhere of himself as an extra in a Western. That I would love to see. He'd be easy to pick out, I think.
He would.
You said there's a lot. You said there's a lot to him, and I said, yes, there certainly was.
But the canonization issue is going to have to grapple with these accusations of anti-Semitism.
Right.
How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I would. That's a great question.
We're here with Brian Daigle, the headmaster and co-founder of Sequitur Classical Academy in Baton Rouge. Thank you so much, Brian, for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
We are delighted to talk with you because of your interest in G.K. Chesterton. We don't get many Chesterton scholars here, and I just want to hear from you what generated your interest in Chesterton.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when I was about 23 years old, I was in graduate school at the University of Dallas, and I took a class on modern theology, and pretty prominent Catholic university in the South. The professor who taught the course was a professor from the theology department, and the whole class was on modern theology. And so at the very end of the class, about 2 weeks before finals, he said, your final assignment is to go find a theologian we didn't cover in class. And I thought, well, what is that going to look like? And so I go to the library, and I begin researching, and I look up obscure Catholic theologians. And I come across this name that was very strange, Gilbert Keith Chesterton. And of course, one of the top books that I see that he wrote is called Orthodoxy. And I think, well, 1874 to 1936, that seems modern. He wrote a book called Orthodoxy. That seems like something a theologian would do. Must be a theologian, a modern theologian. And so I read Orthodoxy, and I give a class presentation on why Chesterton matters for modern theology. And the very next book, 2 weeks that I read on my own after class, was Tremendous Trifles. And I was hooked. So I like to tell people my favorite things and probably the best things about me in life, I came into them backwards. So Chesterton, I came into backwards. Education, I fell into backwards. Meeting my wife accidentally at school one day while we were both teaching, I kind of accidentally fell into. And so I look at Chesterton and I think, along with guys like Dale Alquist, they ask the question, how did a man so large fall through the cracks of Western imagination? How did a man so large? That's, again, a question that Dale often asks. And he's right to ask that question. Chesterton, I believe, in all of the work I've done, is the second most prolific writer in Western tradition, right behind Charles Spurgeon, in terms of quantity of work. And you really do ask the question, how have we forgotten him? How have we forgotten what he's done?
What is your theory as to why he's been forgotten?
Yeah. I think my if I were to be kind with my answer, I think the answer is he's an early 20th century essayist. And who reads essays anymore? Right? I mean, the most popular form of literature right now is the novel, and it's been that way for the past 75 years, if not longer, in Europe and America. And so essays, as they are as a genre, are not loved, are not pursued, are not written, are not taught as they should be. So that's a big one. He wasn't he didn't have a notable professorship anywhere during his life. He wrote in sort of the more academic circles in his discussions of the thinkers of his day. So he wasn't as popular as someone like C.S. Lewis in what he wrote and who his audience was. If I were to probably give more of a candid answer. It's we really do hate what he has to say as moderns.
Oh,
We really do. I mean, we really have a hard time with what he says about how the modern world sees and pursues what it means to be a human. And even if we, as Christians, want to somewhat push against that, I do think we swim in the waters. And in many ways, he is medicine to our souls, and sometimes medicine to a sickness that we hang on to. I think those are big reasons. Yeah, he's also not too easy to read sometimes. In fact, this morning, I was in the hotel, and I had a book, and I was reading it in the lobby, and I had my headphones in, and I hear two men across from me. They were businessmen downtown Chicago, and one of them goes, they didn't know I was listening, and one of them goes, "Hey, have you ever read what that guy's reading?" I was reading Chesterton, and the other guy goes, I have once, I think. He goes, "Yeah, I've read him once. He's pretty hard." And the other guy said, "He's kind of like studying calculus."
really?
Wow.
Yeah, he said it's so dense and so deep, and I just couldn't keep up with it. And then the conversation ended, and I thought that really is the general experience sometimes with Chesterton, is you read his work and you have to spend time with it. And I can save a few of his literary features until later in the conversation, but I think those are reasons why he's difficult and why people, might not lean into him as much as they lean into someone like Lewis, who, you read him and he's much more.
It would also explain the popularity of books like the quotable Chesterton.
That's right.
Where people extract aphoristic sayings that are delightful.
Yeah.
When I read the quotable Chesterton, I go, this guy is fantastic.
Right.
But maybe those gems are embedded in a lot of turgid prose.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say turgid prose. I would say he was much more engaged in his contemporary culture. Lewis, part of the reason he's accidentally timeless because he didn't comment on this 50s phenomenon or this 60s phenomenon, whereas Chesterton really engaged in politics and social theory and a lot of things that haven't stayed with us. He spent a lot of time talking about distributivism, and now people don't even know what that is.
Yeah.
So I think Lewis was lucky in that he wasn't very engaged in a lot of contemporary newspaper
He just wasn't
type topics.
interested in politics.
Yeah, he thought Tito was the king of Greece. He just didn't follow. His brother had to explain these very basic things to him. Whereas Chesterton, a lot of his writings, they were speaking very clearly to that moment, but they don't hold up as well as some other writers that are more general truths about culture.
Yeah. That's a really good point. Right, most of his work was done in essays, and they were done for local news columns.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And they had to be
Relevant.
they had to be contextualized, right then, and they had to use cultural allusions that readers of the newspaper could understand, and that means that modern readers or contemporary or postmodern readers, right, don't understand them at all. Mm-hmm. And so when we teach Chesterton either at the college or in high school or really any time, one of the things I say is you have to make sure that you don't lose interest because you don't know the cultural allusion. I mean, probably every paragraph, there might be 3 or 4 quick ones that he gives. And you could spend a lot of time on one essay going back and saying, why did he use that example or that metaphor or that person or that that exact instant? And that's helpful. It's good to pursue it that far, but it's also dangerous because you begin to lose Chesterton and really a broad pursuit of what he's trying to provide. He gives examples after examples. It's partly what I tell folks when they say, "How do I read him?" Part of what I say is, don't try to get every cultural allusion.
He himself said that. He said when he was a boy, he would read about Cardinal Richelieu, and he could tell that he was cunning and sinister, but he didn't know who he was.
Yeah.
But he almost argues, don't look it up.
Right.
He didn't say don't go to Wikipedia. But often you get from the context what you need to know about that person or that concept.
Yeah.
So that was his own advice about reading: is don't always get bogged down in details.
Yep. And again, as a columnist, as an essayist, it was part of the genre he was writing. And even if you read something like The Ball and the Cross, which is pretty metaphorical, it's so important to say, what is his main idea here? And to constantly be seeing how he's supporting it. And he supports it in a lot of ways. He supports it in many ways, and one of those ways is cultural allusions that, again, can be lost on a contemporary audience. Yeah.
One of his best puns is lost on most contemporary readers. When H.G. Wells was writing really good fantasy writing, and then he switched to socialist tracks, well, he sold his birthright for a pot of message. And if you realize that in the Bible, the brother Esau sells his birthright for a mess of pottage, you get the pun, but not many people would get the pun there.
That's great.
Well, one of his texts that seems to have lasting relevance is The Man Who Was Thursday, because there have been Chicago productions. There was just a production put up several weeks ago directed by Jess Hutchinson. Why do you think The Man Who Was Thursday has continuing interest in contemporary culture?
Yeah. I think one reason might be because it lends itself to a pretty wide reading in terms of the various interpretations that can be taken from it. That's one. I think another one is the particular genre of literature it is. It's not like orthodoxy, which is more philosophical in its base, which is much more prosaic. In the best way, not in the worst way, but much more prosaic. You also find a writer like Chesterton, when he switches between genres, he really does carry about him, which I think is wise and the mark of a great author. He carries about him an understanding of what it means to persuade his audience with that genre. And I think The Man Who Is Thursday does that in a way that his other genres do not do. I also think, particularly for a contemporary audience, the ability to read metaphor into the text, the ability to even be confronted with it in a way that isn't leaving them defenseless, which sometimes can feel in some of his other essays or his other works. So.
Can I go back to an earlier situation you mentioned? You said you had to give this talk on the relevance of Chesterton in today's world. What did you say in that first talk?
I think the first time I ever had to defend why Chesterton mattered, it was in this graduate school class. And I remember distinctly having to defend and discuss the idea of orthodoxy. The idea of orthodoxy. And this wasn't a distinctly, what they might call a progressive liberal theology course. It wasn't that at all. But there were some ideas that we entertained that were on the cutting edge of contemporary Catholic theology. And it was very interesting to look at someone like Chesterton, who came to the Catholic faith later in life, but even before that was arguing for a very commonsensical theology. And that's where I found myself. It was interesting that I was in a Christian context, doing something that was more academic, looking at Chesterton, who probably could not be considered an academic in the professional sense. Yeah. Right. I mean, in the professional sense, not an academic, not someone who would probably be considered by many theologians a theologian. Right. He never wrote a text on theology proper. Right. He didn't write something like De Trinitate or anything of that nature. He was writing in a way that really does hit all of our common sensibilities, and it is very difficult to go into an academic setting and talk about how lost a soul can become because of academia. And yet Chesterton says this is exactly what happens. And it can happen with theology, right? That's why he calls it, when he talks about the both the beauty and the boundaries of what orthodoxy allows for us to do.
I've always thought that was an unfortunate title. He was so witty with tremendous trifles and all the other things. When you see orthodoxy, it just seems kind of daunting and abstract.
Right.
It's too bad because the book itself is very readable.
No, right.
And it's got a lot of memoir elements. You know, when he's a child watching the man with the mustache going across the tight wire. We should have a contest of a better name for orthodoxy to get people to read it.
Right. Well, I think it is just like him, and it's funny. I think I agree with you, but I also think it's just like him to name it that, so that you and I look at it and we go, that seems a little daunting and not very creative. And then we look at why he called it that, and we're going, oh, he's trying to turn us upside down, right? He's trying to turn us upside down in what we think is very daunting, but really is very common sense, something like the Apostles' Creed, right? Which is the impetus of the text, to say something so basic, almost like a childlike faith, right? Maybe that's what we could call it, a childlike faith, right? Something so basic, almost like a childlike faith, the Apostles' Creed, is actually the entirety of what we ought to know about human existence and everything else that we attach to it, political theory and the flags of the world and those sort of things. And so again, it is just like him to kind of look at what he calls, especially in his educational theory, which I'll talk about this evening. He says it's precisely the educated who need to be uneducated, and that is oftentimes what he's doing. He looks at his contemporary thinkers and he says, "You really have been thinking too much." Right? In Orthodoxy, he says that the person who goes crazy is not the poet, but the philosopher. Right? Because the poet tries to put his head in the clouds, and the philosopher tries to put all the clouds in his head. Yeah. And so a title like that, you look at it and you say, even like a title like "The Man Who Is Thursday," going through the how he portrays the calendar days, or the characters in the text. He is the entirety of his project and everything he does is to educate, and really to educate in the most common way. Right. The other argument that I made in the class was that he was the common man's theologian, which is so refreshing, I think, in today's Christendom. Not just in Roman Catholicism, not just in Anglicanism, not just in the evangelical circles, but really, when you look at where Christendom is, and you're saying, what sort of voice do we need, especially in the U.S. right now, to help us navigate these waters of modern ideas which have matured perhaps to their fullest practical extent, other ideas that we don't even know what to do with right now, that he perhaps faced or didn't face in his own day in the early 1900s. His love for humor, his love for wit, his deep insight, his common approach to things. I think all of those are really great, again, antidotes to some of our problems. Right.
I wonder if his being a lay theologian gave room for Lewis and Dorothy Sayers to say, oh, this has been done before. There's been a trailblazer. And so both of them also come with the kind of broad Christian worldview that anybody can understand and resonate with. You talk about coming at things backwards. I already knew Lewis well when I started reading Chesterton. It's Chesterton starts out as a child of seeing this man on the tightrope and the princess in the window. And I said, well, you got that from Surprised by Joy, where he sees this biscuit tin with a garden. Somehow this child's sense of artfulness and how reality is surrounded by imagination, it's the same opening image for the memoir. And I suddenly realized it's the other way around. I think Lewis got that idea subliminally. He got that concept from reading Orthodoxy.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And Sayers actually wrote that this was after Chesterton died. She wrote a note to Chesterton's wife saying that your husband's books have become more a part of my mental makeup than those of any writer you could name. And in one of her letters, she says that the only reason she didn't become a logical positivist, which is a very modernist paradigm, is because of G.K. Chesterton. So he has had a profound impact on people who are still being read and talked about today. And that is significant. So my next question then, related to that, would be about his conversion to Roman Catholicism. How do you interpret that move on his part?
Yeah, I think I look at his movement into particularly the Roman Catholic. Well, you start broadly, right, and you say, what was his movement into Christian thought? He was baptized, I think, June 1st, I believe it was. He was born May 29th, or June and July 1st. And it's funny, in his autobiography, he talks about he was baptized right across the street from the water tower works there in his hometown. And he said because he perhaps it was a cruel joke by God to make everyone believe that he needed all the water to save him. He grew up in a pretty tepid Christian environment. His dad was a lovely, smart man, owned a small business and home. Mom was a pretty normal, jolly, witty, early 20th century, mother and wife. He had a brother, Cecil, who was 5 years younger than him. He had a sister, Beatrice, they call her Bertie, who was 5 years older than Chesterton, who passed away when Chesterton was 8. And that was something that I want to explore more, how that played a role in his world. Supposedly, her picture in the house was turned around on the wall, and it was something you didn't talk about much. Her passing. She died of typhoid fever. Again, when Chesterton was 8 or 9, then Cecil was probably about 3 or 4 at that age. But he grew up in a home that went to church irregularly, and when they did, they went to a Unitarian church. And he talks about Ian Kerr, who's a theology professor at Oxford, in his biography of Chesterton, talks about how Chesterton remembers this Unitarian preacher having great rhetorical abilities, almost like not to this extent, of course, but like an Augustine Ambrose sort of thing, right? Where Augustine drank in the pure waters of truth by hearing, right, these beautiful earthen vessels, he called them, from Ambrose. That's not what Chesterton did, but he remembers this Unitarian preacher having really great kind of poetic elements to his sermons, and it gave him a decent amount of interest. But through his boyhood, into his years going into the Slade School, he was only there for a year. He had a tepid interest in this stuff, but he was very much doing what a lot of the European intellectuals were doing, which is exploring a lot of other ideas. He did not go so far as someone like Leo Tolstoy, right, who totally abandoned the faith, and then at 50 eventually had this major serious conversion, near moments of almost isolation and suicide. That's not where Chesterton got, but you see him exploring some other ideas. And thankfully, in a general sense, he kept coming back to basic Christian doctrine as the answer to all the problems he was seeing around him. And so you see something like Orthodoxy written when it was. That was before his Catholic conversion, well before his Catholic conversion. And so you see his interest and his imagination still filling up with this stuff. And it wasn't until later that I think all of his questions that were still unresolved were ultimately answered in distinctly Roman Catholic doctrine. And those are questions of mystery, themes you see all throughout his work, questions of faith, questions of reason, questions of tradition, questions of even some of his concerns with Puritanism or Calvinism. Those are big parts of his movement away from any sort of Protestant Reformed thinking and profession of Christian faith into a distinctly Roman Catholic one. I think his idea of home, these sort of ideas, imagination of home, were all major parts of his movement into the church. And you see actually a lot of contemporary authors. Bishop Barron added Chesterton in his video series he did on major Catholic authors. Joseph Pierce writes a whole lot about the Catholicism of Chesterton and what that means. I think
a lot of Catholic converts, they want to get back to the supernaturalism, especially feeling that Anglicanism is very tepid, it's moral platitudes.
Yep.
T.S. Eliot had a Unitarian upbringing, and he later said that Unitarianism is the mattress that Christians fall on when they're falling out of Christian faith. But after he became a Christian, an Anglican, he's talked about coming from a non-Christian household. He considered Unitarianism to be so far away from the truth of the Trinity and the Incarnation that he didn't even consider that to be a Christian background on his part.
Yeah, I think the Everlasting Man is a text that allows us to see a lot of the basic questions that eventually Chesterton found answered in the Roman Catholic Church, including the question of the supernatural. What is the best way for us to actually, have and believe in the supernatural? And what happens if we don't believe in that anymore? I mean, and again, he's asking these questions when it was wildly unpopular to do so. Early 1900s Europe, you can see this in his work, the idea of how rampant materialism is around him, and wanting to find a whimsical answer, not just for those around him, but really for himself.
He had kind of self-confidence in his faith. I think when you're that intelligent, so often Christians say, how can we be appealing to secular culture, and how can we water it down so that it's somehow acceptable to them? And Chesterton would just say, well, modernism, they're just bragging about being in the mode right now. Might as well call it Mondayism or morningism.
Yeah, right.
And all the other Christians tend to be kind of creeping around on tiptoes, saying, we don't want to offend these people. We want to show they're intellectually respectable. And I loved his bonhomie in just taking the battle to the secularist and doing debates and being so witty about it. Somebody called him a Christian Oscar Wilde. He has all these great epigrams that he likes to use. Yeah, it's just his spirit but also the joyfulness and the playfulness and the gratitude. He's not grave like some theologians. He really, somehow there's this joie de vivre that comes through in his faith. It's not at all oppressive. So Lewis said he loved him despite the fact that he was Christianity. I think, once again, he said it's common sense. But you can see a lot of that witticism certainly being encouraged in Lewis and his later writings.
Yeah.
The story I love is when he was addressing in a newspaper the question, what is wrong with England today? And he writes in, I am.
Right.
It's just so profound because it forces you to think. It's not a cliche, but it gets at the heart of Christian dogma.
Yeah.
I mentioned the influence of Lewis. When somebody wrote to Lewis and said, what is a soul? He said, I am.
Yeah.
Or anyone who can say, I am. But I wonder if he's riffing on that Chesterton quote.
Maybe.
My favorite, this isn't about Christian faith, but he was a hefty gentleman. And during the World War I, a woman said, sir, why aren't you out at the front? And he turned sideways and he says, if you'll take a look, I think you can see I am out at the front. It's pretty good repartee there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is one thing when we look at when we as Christians look at Chesterton and we say, what can we learn from him? One of the big things we can learn from him is that, and this is where my interest has continued to reside with him in one sense, right? We're called as Christians to love God with our minds. And I can't think of many better models. I can't think of better models than someone like Chesterton, who was not afraid of any idea, wasn't afraid to consider any idea, to go talk with anyone who had ideas, to look at what ideas he might hold. And there is an assurance about that is attractive. There is a humility about that's attractive. There's a courage about it. He said that a man who accepts a duel is always to be honored, even if he loses. And those sort of things we have lost, particularly because I think we've played into certain contemporary cultural hands that are not of Christ. And one of those is being able to look at every idea squarely and entertain them not with fear and not with a consideration that it might be good for us to stay there for a long time, but really in a consideration of of synthesis and putting them in dialogue with what we know about our Christian faith.
Right.
And then he did it in a way that was incredibly attractive even to his enemies. Even to his enemies, he was appreciated and respected. And that's another part of it too, is he also understood a distinction between how a man thinks and how a man lives and who the man is. And those distinctions are important to see, not only the consequence of ideas, but also the boundaries of ideas. And that you can engage an idea with great vigor and even great violence in a good sense, and not have to treat the man that way.
Right.
Yeah.
He was a real model of civility. It's interesting that he could be genuine friends with Bernard Shaw and some of the other skeptics he debated.
That's exactly right.
And I remember William F. Buckley used to having the firing line debates with John Kenneth Galbraith or some, but they really were friends and they liked each other. And I wish that model of civility could be resurrected by people like Chesterton and Lewis and others.
You know, there's Dale Ahlquist and a few others are leading the charge in getting him canonized, perhaps, who knows when. And I think there's been an official opening of his Chesterton's canonization in Rome, at least a consideration of it. But part of the rule is when someone's canonized, all their work has to be read. And so how do you do that? But the question is really fun, and it's one that we've kind of asked, and I don't know if Dale has answered it squarely, and that is, if he's canonized, what will he be the saint of? Right? Is he the saint of humor? Is he the saint of the common man? Is he will he be the saint for journalists? And that's a fun question. Whatever Lewis said. Lewis said, whether you believe you should be praying to the saints or not, you should at least be praying with them. And so, even if that's the case for those of us who are not Roman Catholic, and you say, with respect to the tradition, what will be the thing that he is loved for in the church? And I think that's a fun question to ask, because he has so many sides. One of our conferences a few years ago in Louisiana was called The Many Sides of G.K. Chesterton. And we talked, we had speakers come in and we talked about Chesterton the philosopher, and Chesterton the poet, and Chesterton the husband, and you go
the
through
artist.
these.
We haven't talked about the artist.
The artist. Right. And you say, there is a lot to the guy.
I read in a film book that Chesterton was part of the Stoll Moving Picture Theater Club, that he actually hung out with people to discuss movies. But I haven't been able to verify that citation. Have you ever run into that?
I have not, but that doesn't mean it's not true.
Go along with his interest in the visual arts.
Right.
But also his openness to something that was relatively new, this new technology, and he was willing to consider it.
Well, he claimed to be an extra in a Western. He and his friend, it was Hilaire Belloc or someone like that. They were hanging out in the studio lot, and they said, we need some cowboys in the background. So he swears there's some footage somewhere of himself as an extra in a Western. That I would love to see. He'd be easy to pick out, I think.
He would.
You said there's a lot. You said there's a lot to him, and I said, yes, there certainly was. He and Shaw was very a tall, lean figure. And one time when he ran into Bernard Shaw, he said, why, Shaw, to see you, you'd think there's a famine in England. And Shaw said, well, to see you, you'd think you caused it. So they had a lot of that kind of repartee going back and forth.
But the canonization issue is going to have to grapple with these accusations of anti-Semitism that you find in Chesterton.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I would. That's a great question. I mean, there's always whenever I read someone and I think, he's doing something or he's saying something that I'm not comfortable with, or that I might think is out of bounds for proper Christian thinking or something, I always ask myself, it's very similar to reading scripture. Either I'm reading him wrongly, or I'm reading it rightly, and I might be wrong. Right. So I might be reading him wrongly. In other words, what he's saying, I'm interpreting that way, might not be the case. There's also a sense in which, how much was he a person of his times, right? That we can look at his writings and particularly maybe some of these passages or excerpts and say he was maybe he adopted more than he should have. I'm not sure where I stand on that issue. Maybe he was entertaining an idea and we think he's advocating for it. Those are the things I leave up to the experts, and hopefully those kind of dialogues are important to have too. One of the things I tell folks whenever they read Chesterton is, just like with anyone, you can't swallow him whole. Right, you really do have to consider him and put him into your own sentiments. He had a in the best way. He had a critical spirit, and what can come with that sometimes is being critical in the wrong direction or being cynical in the wrong direction. And if we do believe that there's no that there's no inerrancy in him, right? That he can't err as a person, then how is it that we see some of those errors? And again, right? Lewis talks about how every age has its blinders, and it's kind of requisite blinders for being who it is, for being the age that it is, and we look back on those and we say, how can they believe that? So, to what extent those things are rampant, to what extent they are disqualifying for his placement in the church, even his own our own ability to read him and love him, I think are good to ask. Personally, I've not come across something within his thought that I look at and say, this is a disqualifying element for me to read him and love him and teach him to students or my own children. Even his views on Calvinism, which I'm a big fan of Calvin as an Anglican priest. I love all that Calvin has to give us in many, many ways. But you also have to read him and say, what is he doing here? What is he saying here? The funny thing, I almost did this in a provocative way a few years ago at a conference on Chesterton. I almost gave a talk on where Chesterton has gone wrong. And I decided not to because I just didn't think it was the right venue. But I think it's an important question to ask. And I think it's fair. I think he would have done that to himself, to say, where might I have gone wrong? And maybe on some of these topics, right, of things he said about, leveled against him on anti-Semitism, or what he said about Calvinism versus what he said about Calvin. I find it always interesting that Chesterton rarely quotes people. He rarely quotes people. He doesn't give extended quotes from their work. Even something like you see in Augustine with Scripture, right? I mean, Augustine just wove it into, let's say, Confessions, every other thing. I mean, Chesterton as a journalist did a lot of broad sweeping sometimes. Right. And that can be very dangerous. Right. And I think that ought to be considered.
Yeah.
Well, he was such a great stylist. Sometimes I think his style, he got carried away with his own writing style. Yeah. Lewis read his biography of Robert Browning, the poet. And Lewis said it was full of great insights, but I couldn't tell if he'd actually read any Robert Browning. It was just his witty impressions, It
That's
wasn't
exactly right.
detailed.
Right, yeah. You don't get that impression with his work on Charles Dickens.
Right, he loved Dickens. Yeah.
Right, you see it. I mean, as a great English novelist, you're expecting, of course, Chesterton, and we know this about his dad, that his dad read a lot of English literature to them and knew it well and passed it on to his two boys. So you get the sense in some works that he really has read them extensively. In other works, you're going, how much has he read that? Right? It's like the question of like, how much has he read Calvin, and how much is he responding to Calvinism of the early 1900s, which are two very different things.
Yes.
Two very different things, right? I mean, it's one thing to read Isaac Watts, right, the great Puritan. It's another thing to actually discuss Puritanism, right, and its movement throughout the past 300 years.
Well, that even happens with Marx. I mean, I think Marx would be ashamed of a lot of things that were said and done in his name.
That's right. That's right. And that's why for me, when I look at my interest in classical education and my interest in Chesterton, it really is the coinciding component is how can we have good paradigms of the world, which Chesterton really had, and how can we also go back to primary sources and even have our 11th graders read Karl Marx and consider in his Communist Manifesto what might be a caricature of Marx and Marxism and what might be something we should consider. Like when he says, that one of the greatest flaws of a democracy or capitalistic economy is that every relationship turns into an opportunity for financial gain. And you're saying, and I asked the 11th graders, do you think this is true?
Yeah.
And of course we know this could be true, right? I mean, of course it's possible in the heart and soul of man.
Right.
That sounds like something Chesterton would say. He was pretty critical of capitalism as well.
Yeah.
He said, Americans have hearts of gold, but gods of brass. He was so quotable. I guess that's why we have so many quotable Chestertons.
Yeah. And again, in his quotes, he's it's enough for us to almost get a full meal sometimes. Yeah.
When you mention Dickens, sometimes it's some kind of a throwaway epigram, but other times it's such a pithy insight. He said of Dickens, he didn't give the readers what they wanted. He wanted what they wanted. He was very much a part of that Victorian worldview of social advancement and measuring who's got this position. And I think it was a fascinating insight that he wasn't trying to consciously appeal to the readers. He was just on the same wavelength as the readers. So that's a very good insight for one sentence, I think.
Yeah.
Well, and that goes back to the whole issue of anti-Semitism. You mentioned that he was part of a certain cultural moment. And even the darlings of modernism, Virginia Woolf made anti-Semitic remarks.
Yeah.
Gertrude Stein made anti-Semitic remarks. And that doesn't excuse it.
Right.
But it just shows how they were embedded in a certain discourse that just made them stop thinking about the implications of what they were saying.
Well, and it's almost, and I think the importance of us realizing our own cultural moment and how we read Chesterton, it's like reading Flannery O'Connor, right? And living in the South right now and going and hearing people around you say, how could she say that in her literature? And you say, well, because of where she lived and the questions that she was wrestling with as a finite, fallen person. And it doesn't mean that she advocated for that worldview. It means that she is fully human and that she can't avoid living in a time and a place.
And it should force us to consider what are the blind spots we have.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
In our own cultural embeddedness.
Yep, that's exactly correct. And that's part of my interest in looking at someone like Chesterton and saying, of all the people that I could spend time reading and talking about and writing on and helping to get republished, and of all the people in all of Western tradition, why him? And part of my answer for that is he is such an important person, an important voice in this cultural moment that I find myself in. How often his writings have helped me to say, how do I speak to that topic? How do I say something both rhetorically and logically, and perhaps poetically, so that I am loving my neighbor and I am loving God and I'm being as fair as I possibly can be with all the blinders that I know are there. And so, that he's played an important role for me personally to try to answer those questions, even apologetical questions. And those are, it's like he's close enough to our time, especially where the ideas he was dealing with. He's close enough to the enemies that we still have today as Christians, at least the intellectual enemies, but he's far enough removed from what we're dealing with in 21st century America, where he's both. He really does offer a solid ground to walk on, but it's down a different path. It's still within the same general vicinity that we need. He's not so far off that he's inaccessible, perhaps like an ancient author would be, but he's enough removed to where he makes us reconsider how we're looking at the woods, how we're looking at the trees.
Everything you say reminds me of another Chesterton quote. A lot of times you meet embittered, recovering fundamentalists, recovering Catholics. Somehow or other, they feel emotionally damaged by their background. And Chesterton said, if you can't get close enough to Christianity to love it, at least get far enough away that you don't hate it.
Yeah.
And a lot of those, if I had a friend who was a speechwriter, I would send them some Chesterton books, because so many things he says. I was just reading this morning, he was talking about reformers. The baby's consistently made sick by this food. And he says, rather than getting rid of the food and asking for new food, they want to get rid of the baby and ask for a new baby. And those little epigrams are so applicable to things going on right now.
Yeah. They are, and they're universal enough where you can see why someone like Lewis, who was also searching, right, for most of his life, would read someone like Chesterton or like MacDonald and say, I am different. I mean, I can actually see things completely different than I had before. Those kind of older moment conversions that you see in some of these great guys and men and women in history are so beautiful, and they're possible today even. And that's why, again, a voice like Chesterton, who really can lend some depth of answer to the questions that are all around us. The voices like that are so important to keep alive and keep prevalent and keep within our cultural memory, and to think of the folks within academia, the folks within the Roman Catholic Church, the folks within Christianity who haven't even heard the name Chesterton. There's the only freestanding statue of Chesterton in the world is 45 minutes from our house in Ponchatoula, Louisiana. Yeah, it's really great. In fact, it's there's a Dr. Benson, who loves Chesterton, so he created Chesterton Square and Chesterton Hall in this little town called Ponchatoula. And there is he commissioned a sculptor to build this big sculpture, and on the side it says, "The most quoted man in the 20th century." The most quoted man. There's
Wow.
4 sides to the base of the sculpture piece, and one of the sides says the most quoted man in the 20th century. And again, you think, how is he falling through? What are we missing that he's able to fall through like this?
There was an epigraph for someone else that said, I think it was Gilbert and Sullivan, the lyricist, it said his foe was folly, his weapon was wit. That always strikes me. That would be a good epigraph for Chesterton.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's a great one.
Thank you so much, Brian, for joining us today and giving us new ways to think about Chesterton.
You're welcome. Yeah, thank you
Really
so much.
enjoyable.
And thank you for the work that you're doing here. It is honorable and it is good. And it's a delight to be here and be a small part of it. And so thank you.
Okay, thanks for joining us. Really enjoyable.